compounded by the fact that the productive capacity of the sub-branch of department I which produces means of production for the production of means of production, must normally be geared to the general demand for the renewal of fixed capital, at least in its social average. Thus, while this sub-branch may be overtaken by peak demand at the moment of overheating, it will suffer from unused capacity during a considerable part of the trade cycle. I-10-12. Money circulation, money capital and money hoarding. One of the most modern aspects of Marx's analysis is the treatment in Volume 2 of the commodity-money dialectic, and its correlation with problems relating to the reproduction of social capital in the trade cycle. Here, Marx fundamentally anticipates the Keynesian problematic of money hoarding, that is, withdrawal of money from the process of productive circulation, i.e. circulation geared to the realization and reproduction of surplus value. Marx starts from the assumption that, in order for the process of reproduction to flow smoothly, all income generated in the production process must be spent on the commodities produced. Any additional purchasing power injected into the reproduction process at a given point must be expelled at another point, if the process is to continue in a balanced way. Now, it so happens that the very functioning of the capitalist mode of production leads to periodic hoarding of money capital. We have already 110. See below, pp. 542-5. Of course, academic economic theory later took over this essentially Marxist contribution to the theory of the trade cycle. Introduction 75 encountered this problem with regard to discontinuous renewal of fixed capital. Marx points out that successive expansions and contractions of the circulation time of commodities, related to phases of the trade cycle, result in periodic expansions and contractions of money capital as compared with productive capital. In the same way, the shortening or lengthening of the production process itself, for instance, increase or reduction of the weight within the total product mix of commodities requiring a lengthy production time, gives rise to contraction or expansion of the volume of money capital in circulation. The shorter the production time, the quicker will be the turnover of productive capital itself, and the smaller will be the money reserves which the capitalists have to throw into circulation, in order to cover the wages bill and their own consumption needs until the commodities worked upon in their factories are finished and sold. Conversely, a lengthening of the production time will result in a lengthening of the turnover time of capital, and an increase in the reserves of money capital and money revenue that have to be injected into the circulation process to maintain consumption until the production and sale of the commodities is completed. More generally, the harmonious flow of expanded reproduction is constantly threatened, not permanently upset, of course, because there are always capitalists who buy without selling, and others who sell without buying. Money is continually being withdrawn from circulation, and additional money is forever being injected. Only if these movements cancel each other out will the partially autonomous character of the money flow not conflict with the need to realize the total value of commodities produced. While the banking system objectively strives to achieve that balance, and thus represents a force of social accounting and centralization far superior to anything private ownership could accomplish in the realm of production, it does not have the means to ensure automatic and continual balancing. Here there appears a further cause of discontinuity or interruption of expanded production, a cause which, though derived from monetary phenomena, is of course essentially rooted in the contradictory nature of the commodity and of the production of value and surplus value. It follows that a series of proportions, additional to those which emerge prima facie from the reproduction schemas, play an important role in amplifying, if not triggering off, the trade cycle. The way in which the total money stock is divided between circulating money and hoarded 111. See below, pp. 358-9, 364-6. 76 Introduction Money L12. The way in which circulating money is divided between circulating money capital and circulating revenue. The way in which hoarded money is divided between latent potential productive capital, i.e. money capital which will tend to contribute to increased production of surplus value, and capital which is more or less permanently hoarded, i.e. withdrawn from both the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation of commodities. All these proportions significantly influence the volume and rhythm of capital accumulation. 113 Keynes was correct when he discarded the assumption of more or less permanent full employment of manpower and capital, or at least, the hypothesis that it could be achieved automatically through the operation of market forces. He was also right to point out that capital or revenue not spent, hoarded, is an important source of disequilibrium and underemployment of productive resources in an economy based upon generalized commodity production. In fact, Marx had argued as much 65 years earlier, in Capital Volume 2. But the latter's understanding of the fundamental mechanisms of the capitalist mode of production proved more profound than that of Keynes. For Marx went a step further by distinguishing between productive investment, investment leading to increased production of surplus value, and unproductive investment, which cannot directly augment the total social wealth and real income, but only contribute indirectly to reallocation and redeployment of existing resources. After all, building pyramids and digging canals in order to fill them up again does not have the same effect upon economic growth, capital accumulation and expanded reproduction as building new factories and opening up new oil fields. Buying government bonds in order to finance the building of pyramids is evidently not the same kind of activity as the investment of productive capital. L14112. See below, pp. 260-61. 113. In his latest book, Emmanuel correctly stresses the role of hoarding in Marx's theory of crises. He uses the expression void, a chat, purchasing desire, as opposed to pouvoir d'achat, purchasing power, op-cit. pp. 61 ff. 114. Paul Maddock, Marx and Keynes, London, 1969, does not make the matter any clearer by a confused use of the concept, waste production. Waste, in the sense of products not entering into the reproduction process, and waste, in the sense of unsellable products, are not at all identical concepts. Luxury products are, like arms, commodities, and they find buyers. Public works and other infrastructural outlays are not carried out for the purpose of sale, but in order to accelerate the turnover of capital and thereby indirectly to increase the production of surplus value. However, pyramids or canals which are dug and then filled up again are pure waste. They are neither commodities to be sold nor means of hastening the turnover of capital. Introduction 77. From the elements of monetary analysis dispersed throughout Volume 2, it is possible to identify, within the framework of Marxist economic theory, 4 distinct causes of rising commodity prices. These causes are the following. A fall in the average productivity of labor in a given branch of output, for example, in certain agricultural or mining branches, where a decline in natural fertility is not completely offset by technological progress, prices would then rise as the result of an increase in value of particular commodities, in the quantity of social labor necessary for their production, b. A sudden increase of labor productivity in the gold mining industry, and thus a decline in the value of gold, all other things remaining equal, the same mass of commodities would then be exchanged for a greater amount of gold produced by the same quantity of labor as before. In other words, the gold price of commodities would rise. C. An upward trend of market price fluctuations around an unchanged axis of values. This may occur, even when the gold currency remains stable and when there is no paper money inflation, at that precise stage of the trade cycle marked by the periodic contraction of the hoarded part of money as compared to the circulating part. D. An inflationary movement of money signs. In this case, a constant amount of gold, which exchanges against the same amount of commodities as before on the basis of an unaltered quantity of socially necessary labor, becomes represented by a greater sum of paper money signs, or of bank money, credit money. 0.11s13. Growth and Crisis. The central message of Volume 2, like that of Volume 1, refers to a terrifyingly dynamic process. Volume 1 indicates why capital, by its very essence, is value in perpetual search of additional value, produced by the workers in the process of production. The unquenchable thirst for surplus value is the fundamental motor of economic growth, technological revolution, research and development, spending, improvement of communications, third world aid, the sales drive and market research. A corresponding quest for individual enrichment appears at the core of every level of bourgeois society, together with increasing 115. Karl Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Moscow, 1971, pp. 118-20. See also Grundrisse, op-cit, pp. 121-2 and 212-13. 78. Introduction. Alienation of workers and human beings, and a growing threat that the forces of production will be transformed into forces of destruction. Paradoxical. Why? Mankind increasingly loses control over its own products and productive endeavor at the very moment when its mastery of nature and natural forces seems to be developing by leaps and bounds. 116. In Volume 2 of Capital, we follow the commodities, containing the surplus value produced by the workers, on their travels outside the factory. A spiraling movement of growth is unleashed. A veritable avalanche. 117. The sale of commodities at their value enables profit to be realized and additional capital to be accumulated. More capital begets more surplus value, which in turn begets more capital. Obstacles on the road of self-expansion, such as the enforced lingering of commodities in the sphere of circulation, or the protracted character of the production process itself, are swept away by the avalanche, thanks to social division of labor within the capitalist class, the appearance of commercial and banking capital, and the constant striving to accelerate the transport of commodities, build up a worldwide system of communications and reduce the length of the circulation process to a minimum. An immense mountain of commodities is distributed with lightning speed around the globe, so that a steadily growing stream of value, money capital, may be concentrated in the hands of an ever smaller percentage, if not necessarily a shrinking absolute number, of the world's active population. Today's real masters are to be found in probably no more than 1,000 or 2,000 firms the world over. 11s116. This domination of nature increasingly takes the form of the destruction, Raubbau, of nature, as is shown by the threats to ecological equilibrium. 117. Marx and Luxemburg borrowed the image of the spiral as an expression of the form of capitalist development from Simon de Sismondi. 118. This does not mean, of course, that the hundreds of thousands of smaller capitalist entrepreneurs, and the several million capitalist rentier families, are not part of the world bourgeoisie, but simply that they no longer command the decisive means of production or take the key investment decisions. Bourgeois society has the form of a pyramid in which the summit of monopolists could not survive without the support of different straight-off large and medium bourgeois and their retainers, as well as the, at least partial, support of sections of the petty bourgeoisie. The notion that capitalism could be abolished by eliminating the monopolists alone does not take account of the fact that capitalism inevitably grows out of even petty commodity production where conditions of money circulation and widespread private ownership of the means of production prevail. If a significant sector of medium-sized capitalist firms is retained, and some of the non-monopolist capitalists are rather large-scale ones, then capitalism would not only survive, but flourish and open up the road leading to the formation of new monopolies. Introduction 79. This frenetic search for additional wealth in order to create even more wealth becomes increasingly divorced from basic human needs and interests, increasingly opposed to the production of a rich individuality, and the rich development of social relations encompassing all human beings. But the process cannot continue smoothly and uninterruptedly. Capital is powerless to overcome the basic contradictions of the commodity and private property. From both sides, the contradictions of production for its own sake, production in order to augment the profits of those who own the major means of production, must lead to periodic discharge in huge social and economic convulsions. Following the social explosion initiated in the Western world by May 68 in France, the severe generalized recession of 1974 to 5119 has confirmed Marx's basic analysis. Capitalist growth cannot but be uneven, disproportionate and unharmonious. Expanded reproduction necessarily gives rise to contracted reproduction. Prosperity inexorably leads to overproduction. The search for the philosopher's stone which would enable market economy, private property, competition, to coincide with balanced growth, and mass consumption to develop apace with productive capacity, despite the capitalist's drive to force up the rate of exploitation, this search will go on as long as the system survives. But it will be no more crowned with success than that which has already been conducted for more than 150 years. The only possible remedy for economic crises of overproduction and social crises of class struggle is the elimination of capitalism and class society. No other solution will be found, either in theory or in practice. This awe-inspiring prediction made by Marx has been borne out by empirical evidence ever since Capital was written. There is no sign that it will be contradicted by current or future developments. Ernest Mandel 119. See the last chapter of Late Capitalism, Op. Cit. And my articles on the generalized recession of the international capitalist economy in Impricore. The 16th of January 1975, the 5th of June 1975, the 18th of December 1975 and the 15th of September 1976. Translator's Preface. The 3 volumes of Capital form a single integral work. As Ernest Mandel explains in his introduction, the later volumes extend, if they do not wholly complete, the theoretical depiction of the capitalist mode of production which Marx embarked upon with Volume 1. The Pelikan Marx Library Capital has therefore been planned and executed as a coherent new edition. Though Volumes 2 and 3 have a different translator from Volume 1, Ben Fowkes and myself have each been able to read the other's work and give advice. On virtually all technical points and matters of terminology, Volumes 2 and 3 follow the lead given in Volume 1. As far as the style of writing is concerned, the difference is to be found between the later volumes and Volume 1, while in some part inevitably reflecting the preferences of the translators, are due to a far greater extent to differences in the original texts. Volume 1 of Capital, which Marx himself prepared for the press and revised after its first publication, is palpably presented to the public as a work of science that is also a work of world literature. Hence not only the splendid rhetoric of many well-known passages, but also the copious references to the works of classical antiquity and Renaissance Europe. Volumes 2 and 3 follow much more in the wake of the less purple passages of Volume 1. Their content is to a far greater extent technical, even dry, and Volume 2, above all, is renowned for the arid deserts between its oases. From the scientific point of view, this is all quite contingent, but it has caused many a non-specialist reader to turn back in defeat. As translator, I have tried to ease the passage as best I could by rendering Marx's prose into as straightforward and contemporary in English as possible. Translators' footnotes and cross-references are designed with the same end in view. But though it is not hard for a new translator to improve on previous editions, I certainly could not claim to have made the later volumes of Capital easy reading. Happily, the Translator's Preface 81 reader of the present edition also has Ernest Mandel's introduction as a guide, and this will come to the rescue, I am sure, at many a tricky point. David Fernbach note in compiling the editorial footnotes, indicated by asterisks etc., the translator has derived much assistance from the Marx-Engels work, MEW, edition of Capital. Note. In this edition numbered footnotes are those of the original text. Those marked by asterisks, etc., are the translator's. Preface. It was not an easy job to prepare the second volume of Capital for publication, and particularly in such a way that it appeared not only as an integrated work, as complete as possible, but also as the exclusive work of its author, and not its editor. The task was made more difficult by the large number of versions, most of them incomplete. Only one of these, Manuscript IV, had been completely prepared for publication, though even here the greater part had been made obsolete by drafts of a later date. The main body of the material, if it was fully worked out in content, in the main, was not so in its language. It was composed in the idiom that Marx customarily used in preparing his summaries, a negligent style, colloquial and often coarsely humorous expressions and usages, English and French technical terms, frequently whole sentences and even pages in English. This is the expression of ideas in the immediate form in which they developed in the author's head. Alongside particular sections that were worked out in detail, there were others, equally important, that were only sketched in outline. The material for factual I-11 illustration had been assembled, but hardly arranged, let alone worked up. At the end of a chapter, in his haste to go on to the next, Marx often left a few disconnected sentences to serve as the guidelines for an as yet unfinished analysis. Finally, there was the notorious handwriting, which even the author himself was sometimes unable to read. I have confined myself to reproducing the manuscripts as literally as possible, altering in the style only what Marx himself would have altered, and only putting in explanatory parentheses and bridging passages where this was absolutely necessary, and the sense quite W1 ambiguous. Whenever there was even the faintest doubt as to the meaning of a sentence, I preferred to print it word for word. The reworkings and interpolations that originate from me amount altogether to less than 10 printed pages, and are of a purely formal character. 84 Preface. It is sufficient to enumerate the manuscript material that Marx left for Volume 2 to show the incomparable conscientiousness and severe self-criticism with which he strove to bring his great economic discoveries to the utmost degree of perfection before publishing them. This self-criticism seldom allowed him to adapt his presentation, either in content or in form, to his mental horizon, which was constantly expanding as the result of new studies. The material, then, consists of the following manuscripts. Firstly, a manuscript entitled Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, 1,472 pages in 23 notebooks, written between August 1861 and June 1863. This is the continuation of the volume of the same title published in Berlin in 1859. The themes investigated in Volume 1 of Capital are dealt with in pp. 1 to 220, notebooks IV, and again in pp. 1159 to 1472, notebooks 1923, from the transformation of money into capital through to the conclusion. This is the first existing draft for Volume 1. Pages 973-1158, notebooks 1618, deal with capital and profit, rate of profit, merchant's capital and money capital, themes that were later developed in the manuscript for Volume 3. The themes treated in Volume 2, however, as well as many treated later in Volume 3, are not yet grouped together. They are dealt with in passing in the section that forms the main body of the manuscript, pp. 220 to 972, notebooks V15, Theorien über den Mehrwert. This section contains a detailed critical history of the crucial question in political economy, the theory of surplus value, while at the same time most of the points that were specifically investigated later in the manuscript for Volumes 2 and 3, in their logical context, are developed here in polemical opposition to Marx's predecessors. My intention is to publish the critical portion of this manuscript, leaving aside the passages already covered in Volumes 2 and 3, as Volume 4 of Capital. But valuable though this manuscript is, it was of little use for the present edition of Volume 2. The next manuscript in chronological order is that of Volume 3. The Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1859. English translation. A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Trail S.W. Ryazanskaya, London, 1971. T. Theorien über den Mehrwert was first published in 1905-10, edited by Karl Kautsky, who took on the work after Engels's death. This edition, however, was far from accurate, and is now generally neglected in favor of that published by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism, Berlin, 1956-62. The remaining part of Marx's gigantic, Zur Kritik. Of 1861-3, approximately half its total million words, has yet to be published. Preface 85 bulk of this, at least, was written in 1864 and 1865. Only after this was essentially complete did Marx proceed to finish off Volume 1, which appeared in 1867. This manuscript of Volume 3 I am now preparing for publication. From the next period, after the appearance of Volume 1. We have a collection of 4 folio manuscripts for Volume 2, numbered IIV by Marx himself. Manuscript I, 150 pages, which appears to date from 1865 or 1867, is the first independent version of Volume 2 in its present arrangement, but a more or less incomplete one. Here, too, nothing could be used. Manuscript 3 consists partly of a compilation of quotations and references to Marx's extract books, mostly related to the first part of Volume 2, partly of elaborations of individual points, in particular criticisms of Adam Smith's ideas on fixed and circulating capital, and on the source of profit. There is also a presentation of the relation between rate of surplus value and rate of profit, which belongs to Volume 3. The references provided little that was new, while the elaborations were superseded by later versions, both for Volume 2 and Volume 3, and so also had to be mostly set aside. Manuscript IV is a version of Part 1 of Volume 2, and the first chapter of Part 2, which Marx left ready for publication, and it has been used in its due place. Even though it was evidently composed earlier than Number 2, it is more complete in form, and could thus be used to advantage for the appropriate portion of the book. It only needed some additions from Manuscript 2. This last manuscript is the only version of Volume 2 we possess which has been even approximately finished, and it dates from 1870. The notes for the final draft, which I shall discuss in a moment, say expressly that the second version must be used as a basis. After 1870 there is a further pause, principally occasioned by illness. As usual, Marx filled this time with study, agronomy, American and particularly Russian rural conditions, the money market and banking, as well as natural science. geology and physiology, and in particular independent mathematical work, form the content of numerous extract books of this period. Early in 1877, Marx felt sufficiently restored. Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, 1776, gave bourgeois political economy its classical form, in a work that was both scientifically important and a major ideological weapon for the developing industrial capitalist class. For both these reasons, Smith's work forms a constant reference point for Marx throughout Capital. In Theories of Surplus Value, in particular, Part 1, Chapter 1 II, Marx develops his fullest critique of Smith's fundamental theoretical conceptions. See also Chapters 10 and 19 in the present volume. 86 Preface to Health to be able to proceed again with his own proper work. References and notes dating from the end of March 1877, taken from the above four manuscripts, form the basis for a new version of Volume 2, begun in Manuscript V, 56 folio pages. This covers the first 4 chapters, but is not very thoroughly elaborated. Essential points are treated in notes below the text. The material is collected rather than sifted, but this is the last complete presentation of the most important portion of Part 1. A first attempt to derive a publishable manuscript from this was made in Manuscript 7, between October 1877 and July 1878, only 17 quarto pages, covering the bulk of the first chapter. A second, final attempt, Manuscript 7, dated the 2nd of July 1878, has only 7 folio pages. By this time Marx seems to have realized that, save for a complete transformation in the state of his health, he would never manage to complete a version of the second and third volumes that he would himself be satisfied with. Indeed, manuscripts V8 bear only too frequently the traces of violent struggle against the oppression of illness. The most difficult bit of the first part was worked over afresh in Manuscript V. The remainder of the first part and the whole of the second part presented no significant theoretical difficulties, with the exception of Chapter 17, but the third part, on the reproduction and circulation of the social capital, seemed to him strongly in need of revision. In Manuscript 2, for example, reproduction was treated firstly without regard to the money circulation that mediates it, and then once again taking this into account. This was to be jettisoned, and the whole part completely revised so as to correspond to the author's expanded horizon. This is how Manuscript 8 came into being, a notebook of only 70 quarto pages, but what Marx managed to compress into this space can be seen from Part 3 in its published form, subtracting the pieces interposed from Manuscript 2. This Manuscript 2 is only a provisional treatment of the subject, the main point being to set down and develop the new perspectives arrived at since Manuscript 2, ignoring those points on which there was no thing new to say. An important section of Chapter 17 in Part 2, which overlaps somewhat into the third part, was also considered again and expanded. The logical sequence is frequently interrupted, and the treatment in places punctuated and especially at the end quite incomplete. And yet what Marx intended to say is said there, in one way or another. That is the material for Volume 2, from which I was to make some. Preface 87 thing, as Marx put it to his daughter Eleanor shortly before his death. I interpreted this commission in the narrowest sense. Wherever possible, I have confined my activity to mere selection between the various drafts, and indeed always used the last existing draft as the basis, comparison being made with the earlier ones. Real difficulties, i.e. those other than merely technical, arose only in the first and third parts, although they were in no way slight. I have sought to resolve them exclusively in the spirit of the author. I have mostly translated, into German, the quotations in the text, where evidence of a factual nature was involved or where, as with passages from Adam Smith, the original is available to anyone who wants to go more deeply into the matter. Only in Chapter 10 was this not possible, as here the English text is criticized directly. The quotations from Volume 1 carry page references to the second edition, the last to appear in Marx's lifetime. For Volume 3, besides the first version contained in the manuscript, Zur Kritik, the pieces in Manuscript 3 already mentioned, and short notes occasionally interspersed in extract books, we have just the folio manuscript of 1864-5 is mentioned, elaborated to approximately the same degree of completeness as Manuscript 2 for Volume 2, and finally a notebook of 1875, entitled The Relation of the Rate of Surplus Value to the Rate of Profit, which is a mathematical treatment in equations. Rapid progress is being made in preparing this volume for publication. As far as I can judge at this moment, it will chiefly involve only technical difficulties, with the exception of a few, though very important sections. It is a suitable place here to rebut a certain accusation made against Marx, first only cautiously and sporadically, but now, after his death, proclaimed by German academic and state socialists and their hangers-on as an established fact. The accusation that Marx plagiarized the asterisk in the present volume. These references have been replaced throughout by corresponding references to the Pelikan Marx Library edition. The reader is also reminded that the division there into chapters and parts follows that made by Engels for the original English edition of 1886, and is different from that of the various German editions. The table on page 110 of Volume 1 shows the relationship between English and German divisions. In fact, 9 years were to elapse before the publication of Volume 3. See Engels's preface to that volume. 88 Preface work of Rodbertus. I have already said elsewhere what it was most urgent to say on this matter. one but only here can I introduce for the first time the decisive evidence. As far as I know, the accusation was first made by R. Meyer in his Emancipationskampf der Wir 10 Standes, page 43. It can be demonstrated that Marx borrowed the greater part of his critique from these publications, the works of Rodbertus dating back to the latter half of the 1830s. I might well take it, until evidence to the contrary is forthcoming, that the entire demonstration of this statement consists in the fact that Rodbertus assured this Herr Meyer of it. In 1879, Rodbertus himself appeared on the scene, and wrote to J. Zeller, Zeitschrift für die gesamte Staatswissenschaft, Tübingen, 1879, page 219, with reference to his text, Zur Erkenntnis unserer Staatswirtschaftlichen Zustände, 1842. You will find that the same thing, the line of thought there developed, has already been nicely used by Marx, of course without acknowledgement to me. This was then echoed in so many words by his posthumous editor T. Kozik, Das Kapital von Rodbertus, Berlin, 1884, Introduction, page XV. Finally, in the Brief und Sozialpolitische Aufsichts von Dr. Rodbertus Jagetzo published by R. Meyer in 1881, Rodbertus says straight out, "Today I find myself robbed by Schafflet and Marx, without my name one." In the preface to Marx's The Poverty of Philosophy, translated into German, by E. Bernstein and K. Kautsky, Stuttgart, 1885. This work of Marx's, first published in 1847 as a reply to Proudhon's book The Philosophy of Poverty, was written in French. The academic socialists, Kathedersozialisten, mentioned here, who flirted with socialism from the safety of their university chairs, first made their appearance in the 1870s. Prominent among them were Gustav Schmaler, Lujo Brentano, Adolf Wagner, Karl Bucher and Werner Sombart. They were outside and generally opposed to the Social Democratic Party. State socialism, the ideology that presents state intervention in the capitalist economy as ipso facto socialist, was a constant object of attack by Marx and Engels, as in the Communist Manifesto, ch. 3, 2, and the critique of the Gotha program. In Germany in the 1880s it was Bismarck's nationalization of the railways, in particular, that was dressed up as socialist, in this way, mainly by the academic socialists. Johann Karl Rodbertus Jagetzo, a Prussian landowner, was the doyen of state socialism in Germany, in practice seeking state support for the development of large-scale capitalist agriculture. T. Rodbertus had in fact died in 1875. The letter published in the Tübingen Zeitschrift was written on the 14th of March 1875. Albert Eberhard Schaffe, a vulgar economist, see page 101, note, and bourgeois sociologist. Marx refers to him in his Notes on Wagner. Preface 89 being mentioned, letter number 60, page 134. In a further passage Rodbertus's claim assumes more specific form. I showed in the third of my social letters how the capitalist surplus value is derived, essentially the same way as Marx, only clearer and more briefly, letter number 48, page 111. Marx never came across these accusations of plagiarism. In his copy of the Emancipationskampf the only pages cut were those of the part relating to the International, until I myself cut the remainder after his death. He never saw the Tübingen Zeitschrift. The brief, etc. to R. Meyer remained equally unknown to him, and I came to know of the passage about the robbery, only in 1884, through the good offices of Herr Dr. Meyer himself. But Marx was familiar with letter number 48. Herr Meyer had been kind enough to send the original to Marx's youngest daughter. After some furtive gossip that the secret sources of his critique were to be found in Rodbertus had reached his ears, Marx showed me the note in question. Here he finally had authentic information as to what Rodbertus himself claimed. If this was all Rodbertus was saying, then Marx was not worried, and if Rodbertus held his own presentation to be briefer and clearer, Marx could also allow him this indulgence. Indeed, Marx believed that the whole matter started and finished with this letter of Rodbertus. Marx was particularly inclined to let the matter lie because, as I know for a fact, he had been quite unaware of Rodbertus's literary activity up till around 1859, by which time his own critique of political economy was finished not only in outline, but even in the most important details. Marx began his economic studies in Paris in 1843 with the great English and French writers. Of the Germans, he was familiar only with Rau and Liszt, and that was enough. Neither Marx nor I had any word of Rodbertus's existence until 1848, when we had to criticize his speeches as a Berlin deputy, and his actions as a minister, in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. We were so ignorant that we had to ask the Rhineland deputies who this Rodbertus was, who had suddenly become a minister. But that Marx already knew very well, even without Rodbertus's help, how the 3rd of Rodbertus's Soziale Briefen von Kirchmann, in which he put forward his theory of rent against Ricardo's, was published in Berlin in 1851. Karl Heinrich Rau was a German economist who vulgarized the theories of Smith and Ricardo, and supported the doctrine of the factors of production put forward by Say. See page 227, note. Friedrich List, the most important German economist of the first half of the 19th century, accurately expressed the demands of the embryonic industrial bourgeoisie in Germany, and is particularly remembered for his forceful arguments for protective tariffs. 90 Preface Capitalist surplus value is derived, is shown by The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, and by his lectures on wage labor and capital, delivered in Brussels in 1847 and published in 1849 in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, numbers 264 to 269. It was only around 1859, via Lassalle, that Marx discovered there was also an economist Rodbertus, and he then found the latter's third social letter in the British Museum. These are the facts of the case. What then about the material of which Marx is supposed to have robbed Rodbertus? I showed in the third of my social letters how the capitalist's surplus value is derived, essentially the same way as Marx, only clearer and more briefly. This then is the decisive point, the theory of surplus value, and it is hard to say what else there is in Marx that Rodbertus could have claimed as his property. Rodbertus here declares that he was the true founder of the theory of surplus value, and that Marx robbed him of it. Now what does the third social letter tell us as to the origin of surplus value? Simply that rent, which is how he lumps together ground rent and profit, does not arise as an addition to the value of a commodity, but rather as a result of a deduction of value suffered by wages, in other words because wages only amount to a part of the value of the product, and if labor is sufficiently productive, they do not need to be equal to the natural exchange value of the product, so that some of this still remains over for capital replacement and rent. We are not told what natural exchange value of the product it is which does not leave anything over for capital replacement, for the replacement of raw material and the wear and tear of tools. Fortunately, we are able to confirm the impression Rodbertus's epoch-making discovery made on Marx. In the manuscript, Zur Kritik, we find in Notebook X, pp. 445 ff. Herr Rodbertus. New theory of rent. Digression. It is only from this point of view that the third social letter is considered here. Rodbertus's theory of surplus value in general is dismissed here with the ironic remark, Herr Rodbertus first investigates the situation in a country where there is no separation between land ownership and ownership of capital. And here, Ferdinand Lassalle, who at this time professed to be a disciple of Marx, one of only a small handful who had been able to remain in Germany after the failure of the 1848 revolution, became in the early 1860s the inspirer and chief organizer of the first mass movement of the modern German working class. Politically, however, he played an ambiguous role in relation to the Bismarck regime. See the First International and After, Pelikan Marx Library, pp. 20 ff. Preface 91. He comes to the important conclusion that rent, by which he means the entire surplus value, is simply equal to the unpaid labor or the quantity of products which it represents. The capitalist world has been producing surplus value for several centuries, and has gradually come to develop ideas about its origin. The first view was that arising directly from commercial practice, that surplus value is derived from an addition to the value of the product. This was the prevailing view among the mercantilists, but James Stoyart already saw that if this were the case, what one man gained, the other would necessarily lose. All the same, this view continued to haunt men's minds for a long time, particularly the minds of socialists, though it was expelled from classical, economic, science by Adam Smith. Smith wrote in The Wealthful Nations, Book 1, Chapter 6. As soon as stock has accumulated in the hands of particular persons, some of them will naturally employ it in setting to work industrious people, whom they will supply with materials and subsistence, in order to make a profit by the sale of their work, or by what their labor adds to the value of the materials. The value which the workmen add to the materials, therefore, resolves itself into two parts, of which the one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer upon the whole stock of materials and wages which he advanced, Pelikan Eden, page 151. And a little further on. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. The laborer must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. This portion, or, what comes to the same thing, the price of this portion, constitutes the rent of land. Single quote. In the above-mentioned manuscript, Zur Kritik, page 253, Marx remarks on this passage, Theories of Surplus Value, London, 1969-72, Part 2, pp. 15-16. Sir James Stewart's Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy was first published in 1767. Stewart was the last representative of the mercantilist school, see below, page 139, note, and his work already represents a transition towards the classical bourgeois analysis of capitalist production by Adam Smith. It is with a short chapter on Stewart, therefore, that Marx opens his theories of surplus value. This passage and those following are quoted by Marx in the manuscript of Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, Chapter 3, 2, pp. 78-85 of the English translation, interspersed with Marx's comments, as cited below by Engels. Marx's emphases in his quotations from Smith, however, differ somewhat in the published version. And thus presumably in the manuscript as well, from those made by Engels here. 92 Preface. Thus Adam Smith conceives surplus value, that is, surplus labor, the excessive labor performed and objectified in the commodity over and above the paid labor, the labor which has received its equivalent in wages, as the general category, of which profit in the strict sense and rent of land are merely branches. Adam Smith says further, Book 1, Chapter VFII, as soon as land becomes private property, the landlord demands a share of almost all the produce which the laborer can either raise, or collect from it. His rent makes the first deduction from the produce of the labor which is employed upon land. It seldom happens that the person who tills the ground has wherewithal to maintain himself till he reaps the harvest. His maintenance is general 1y advanced to him from the stock of a master, the farmer who employs him, and who would have no interest to employ him, unless he was to share in the produce of his labor, or unless his stock was to be replaced to him with a profit. This profit makes a second deduction from the produce of the labor which is employed upon land. The produce of almost all other labor is liable to the like deduction of profit. In all arts and manufactures the greater part of the workmen stand in need of a master to advance them the materials of their work, and their wages and maintenance till it be completed. He shares in the produce of their labor, or in the value which it adds to the materials upon which it is bestowed, and in this share consists his profit. Pelikan Eden, page 168. Marx comments, page 256 of the manuscript. Here therefore Adam Smith in plain terms describes rent and profit on capital as mere deductions from the workman's product or the value of his product, which is equal to the quantity of labor added by him to the material. This deduction, however, as Adam Smith has himself previously explained, can only consist of that part of the labor which the workman adds to the materials, over and above the quantity of labor which only pays his wages, or which only provides an equivalent for his wages, that is, the surplus labor, the unpaid part of his labor. Adam Smith was thus already aware how the capitalist's surplus value is derived, and that of the landlord into the bargain. Marx recognized this quite frankly back in 1861, while Rodbertus and his crowd of admirers, springing up like mushrooms under the warm SWNMER reign of state socialism, seem to have totally forgotten it. Op. Cit. Page 82. T. Ibid. Page 85. Preface 93. Nevertheless, Marx continues, he does not distinguish surplus value as such as a category on its own, distinct from the specific forms it assumes in profit and rent. This is the source of much error and inadequacy in his inquiry, and of even more in the work of Ricardo. This statement applies word for word to Rodbertus. His rent as simply the sum of ground rent and profit, he makes up a totally false theory of ground rent, and takes over profit just as he finds it in his predecessors. Marx's surplus value, however, is the general form of the sum of value appropriated without equivalent by the owners of the means of production, which is decomposed into the particular, transformed forms of profit and ground rent according to quite specific laws that were first discovered by Marx. These laws are developed in Volume 3, where it will be seen how many intermediate terms are necessary in order to proceed from understanding surplus value in general to understanding its transformation into profit and ground rent, and thus to understanding the laws of distribution of surplus value within the capitalist class. Ricardo already went significantly further than Adam Smith. He founded his conception of surplus value on a new theory of value, which although it was present in embryo in Smith, was time and again forgotten in the latter's exposition, a theory that became the starting point of all subsequent economic science. In Ricardo's view, the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor realized in it. From this Ricardo derived the distribution between worker and capitalist of the quantum of value added by labor to the raw materials, its division into wages and profit, surplus value. He showed that the value of commodities remains the same, however the ratio of these two parts may change, a law to which he admits only a few exceptions. He even established some basic laws on the changing ratio between wages and surplus value, conceived in the form of profit, even if in too general a sense. Marx, Capital Volume 1, Chapter 17, 1, and showed ground rent to be an excess over profit that in certain circumstances does not arise. In none of these points has Rodbertus gone beyond page 81. David Ricardo's main work, On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, first appeared in 1817. Ricardo marked the high point of classical political economy, as after 1830 the irrepressible fact of the class struggle of the industrial workers led bourgeois economics to retreat from its own previous scientific discoveries, and to the rise of vulgar economics, see page 101, note. Like that of Adam Smith, Ricardo's work forms a constant reference point throughout Capital, and the bulk of Part 1I of Theories of Surplus Value, in particular, is devoted to a critique of Ricardo's ideas. 94 Preface Ricardo. Either he remained quite unaware of the internal contradictions of Ricardo's theory, which led to the collapse of the Ricardian school, or these led him to utopian demands instead of economic solutions, zur Erkenntnis. Page 130. Ricardo's doctrine of value and surplus value did not have to wait for Rodbertus's zur Erkenntnis to be turned to a socialist purpose. In Volume 1 of Capital, page 734, Marx refers to a pamphlet entitled The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties. A letter to Lord John Russell, London, 1821, containing the phrase, the possessors of surplus produce or capital, 0. The significance of this pamphlet of 40 pages, which Marx rescued from its oblivion, is already indicated by the express scion, surplus produce or capital. It goes on to say, whatever may be due to the capitalist, from the capitalist's standpoint, he can only receive the surplus labor of the laborer, for the laborer must live, page 23. But the manner in which the worker lives, and hence the magnitude of the surplus labor appropriated by the capitalist, are subject to considerable variation. If capital does not decrease in value as it increases in amount, the capitalists will exact from the laborers the produce of every hour's labor beyond what it is possible for the laborer to subsist on. The capitalist may eventually say to the laborers, you shan't eat bread, because it is possible to subsist on beetroot and potatoes. And to this point we have come. pp. 23-4. Single quote. If the laborer can be brought to feed on potatoes instead of bread, it is indisputably true that more can be exacted from his labor. That is to say, if when he fed on bread he was obliged to retain for the maintenance of himself and family the labor of Monday and Tuesday, he will, on potatoes, require only the half of Monday, and the remaining half of Monday and the whole of Tuesday are available either for the service of the state or the capitalist, page 26. It is admitted that the interest paid to the capitalists, whether in the nature of rents, interests of money, or profits of trade, is paid out of the labor of others, page 23. Here then we have precisely Rodbertus's rent, only instead of rent it is called interest. Marx notes on this, Zur Kritik, page 852. This scarcely known pamphlet, about 40 pages, which appeared, at a time when McCulloch, this incredible cobbler, began to make John Ramsay McCulloch vulgarized Ricardo's doctrines. The description was applied to him by a critic, Mordecai Mullion, pseudonym of John Wilson, in some illustrations of Mr. McCulloch's Principles of Political Economy, Edinburgh, 1826. Preface 95 Stir contains an important advance on Ricardo. It bluntly describes surplus value, or profit, as Ricardo calls it, often also surplus produce, or interest, as the author of the pamphlet terms it. As surplus labor, the labor which the worker performs gratis, the labor he performs over and above the quantity of labor by which the value of his labor power is replaced, by which he produces an equivalent for his wages. Important as it was to reduce value to labor, it was equally important to present surplus value, which manifests itself in surplus product, as surplus labor. This was in fact already stated by Adam Smith and constitutes one of the main elements in Ricardo's argumentation. But nowhere did he clearly express it and record it in an absolute form. Marx goes on to say, for the rest, the author remains a captive of the economic categories as he finds them. Just as in the case of Ricardo the confusion of surplus value with profit leads to undesirable contradictions, so in his case the fact that he christens surplus value the interest of capital. To be sure, he is in advance of Ricardo in that he first of all reduces all surplus value to surplus labor, and when he calls surplus value interest of capital, he at the same time emphasizes that by this he understands the general form of surplus labor in contrast to its special forms. Rent, interest of money in industrial profit. But on the other hand, he applies the name of one of these particular forms, interest, to the general form, and this suffices to make him relapse into economic slang. This last passage fits our Rodbertus like a glove. He too remains a captive of the economic categories as he finds them. He too christens surplus value with the name of one of its particular subordinate fonds, rent, which for him, moreover, is something quite indefinite. As a result of these two blunders, he again relapses into economic slang, fails to make any further critical development of his advance over Ricardo, and instead lets himself be diverted into making his unfinished theory, before it has even fully emerged from its shell, the basis of a utopia, which like everything else, he produces too late. The pamphlet quoted above appeared in 1821, and is already a complete anticipation of the Rodbertian rent of 1842. This pamphlet is only the most advanced outpost of a whole group of writings of the 18,208, which turned the Ricardian theory of value and theories of surplus value, Part 1 II, pp. 238-9. T. Ibid. Page 254. 96 Preface surplus value against capitalist production in the interest of the proletariat, and fought the bourgeoisie with its own weapons. The whole of Owen's communism, in so far as it engaged in economic polemics, was based on Ricardo. But besides Owen there was a whole series of writers, of whom Marx mentioned just a few in 1847 in his book Against Proud Hun, Misere de la Philosophie, page 49 T. Edmonds, Thompson, Hodgkin, etc., and 4 pages more of etc. From this plethora of writings, I take just one at random, An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth, Most Conducive to Human Happiness, by William Thompson, a new edition, London, 1850. This text, written in 1822, first appeared in 1824. Here, too, the wealth appropriated by the non-producing classes is described throughout as a deduction from the product of labor, and this in fairly strong terms. The constant effort of what has been called society has been to deceive and induce, to terrify and compel, the productive laborer to work for the smallest possible portion of the produce of his own labor, page 28. Why not give him the whole absolute produce of his own labor? Page 32. This amount of compensation, exacted by capitalists from the productive laborers, under the name of rent or profits, as claimed for the use of land or other articles. For all the physical materials on which, or by means of which, his productive powers can be made available, and their consent being a necessary preliminary to any exertion on his part, is he not, and must he not always remain, at the mercy of these capitalists for whatever portion of the fruits of his own labor they may think proper to leave at his disposal in compensation for his toils, page 125. In proportion to the amount of products withheld, whether called profits, or taxes, or theft, page 126, etc. I admit that I am somewhat ashamed to have to write these lines. The fact that the English anti-capitalist literature of the 1820s and 1830s is so completely unknown in Germany, despite the fact that Marx directly referred to it in The Poverty of Philosophy, and quoted a good deal of it. Robert Owen was the great English representative of utopian communism in the early 19th century. See in particular Engels's Anti-Düring, Part 3, Socialism, Chapter 1, Historical, The Poverty of Philosophy, London, 1966, page 60. Besides Marx's brief reference in The Poverty of Philosophy, a chapter of theories of surplus value is devoted to opposition to the economists, based on the Ricardian theory, Part 1 II, Chapter 21. This deals principally with the works of William Thomson, Percy Ravenstone and Thomas Hodgkin. Thomas Edmonds, however, the author of Practical Moral and Political Economy, 1828, does not reappear in Theories of Surplus Value. Preface 97 in several places, in Volume 1 of Capital. This in itself may pass muster. But that not only the literatus vulgaris desperately clinging on to Rod Bertus's coattails, who really has learnt nothing, but also the professor in high office, who brags of his learning, have forgotten their classical economics to such an extent as to seriously reproach Marx for purloining from Rod Bertus things that can already be read in Smith and Ricardo. This indicates the depths to which official economics has sunk, today. But what then did Marx say about surplus value that was new? How did it happen that Marx's theory of surplus value burst like a bolt from the blue, in all civilized countries, while the theories of all his socialist precursors, Rod Bertus included, petered out ineffectually? The history of chemistry offers us a parallel. Towards the end of the last century, as is well known, the phlogiston theory still prevailed. According to this theory, the essence of all combustion consisted in a hypothetical substance detaching itself from the burning body, an absolute combustible that was given the name phlogiston. This theory was sufficient to explain the greater part of chemical phenomena known at that time, even if the explanation was rather strained in some cases. Now in 1774 Priestley prepared a kind of air, which he found so free of phlogiston that even ordinary air seemed adulterated by comparison. He named this de pH logistica ted air. Shortly afterwards, Scheele prepared the same kind of air in Sweden, and demonstrated its presence in the atmosphere. He also found that it vanished if a body was burned in it or in ordinary air, and therefore called it fire air. From these results, Priestley, now drew the conclusion that the combination produced by the union of phlogiston with one of the components of air, i.e. by combustion, was nothing more than fire or heat, which escaped through the glass. 2. Roscoe and Shore Jenner, Osvilu, Liches Lehrbuch der Chemie, Braunschweig, 1877, pp. 13, 18. Karl Schalener, a German exile and professor of organic chemistry at Manchester University from 1874, was a personal friend of Marx and Engels, and accompanied Engels on his visit to the United States in 1888. He was one of the first natural scientists to adhere to the philosophy of dialectical materialism, as well as a member of the German Social Democratic Party. Common literature. Here an allusion to R. Meyer. This is an allusion to Adolf Wagner, see above, page 88, note. Wagner specifically attacked Marx's economic theory in his book The General or Theoretical Doctrine of Political Economy, 1879. Marx's manuscript, marginal notes dealing with Wagner's critique, written in 1881-2, form his final economic writing. 98 Preface. Both Priestley and Scheele had produced oxygen, but they were unaware of what they had laid their hands on. They remained captives of the pH logistic categories they had inherited. The element that was to overthrow the whole pH logistic conception and revolutionize chemistry was stricken with barrenness in their hands. However, Priestley had immediately informed Lavoisier in Paris of his discovery, and Lavoisier now investigated the whole of pH logistic chemistry with the aid of this new fact. He was the first to discover that the new type of air was a new chemical element, that what happened in combustion was not that a mysterious phlogiston escaped from the burning body, but that this new element combined with the body, and he thus put the whole of chemistry, which in its pH logistic form was standing on its head, onto its feet for the first time. Even if Lavoisier did not himself produce oxygen at the same time as the others, as he later claimed, he remains nonetheless the real discoverer of oxygen, as opposed to Priestley and Scheele, who merely produced it, without having the slightest inkling of what they had produced. Marx is related to his predecessors in the theory of surplus value as Lavoisier is to Priestley and Scheele. The existence of the part of the value produced that we now call surplus value was established long before Marx. What it consists of, the product of labor, for which the appropriator has paid no equivalent, was also formulated with a greater or lesser degree of clarity. But this was as far as it went. Some people, the classical bourgeois economists, investigated primarily the ratio in which the product of labor was distributed between the worker and the proprietor of the means of production. Others, the socialists, found this distribution unjust and sought to remove the injustice by utopian means. Both remained captive of the economic categories as they had found them. Then Marx appeared, and he stood in direct opposition to all his predecessors. Where they had seen a solution, he saw only a problem. He saw that what was involved here was neither dephlogisticated air nor fire air, but rather oxygen, that it was neither a matter of simply recording an economic fact, nor of a conflict between this fact and eternal justice or true morality, but rather of a fact which was destined to revolutionize economics, and which provided the key to the understanding of the whole of capitalist production, for the person who knew how to use it, that is. With the aid of this fact, Marx investigated all the existing categories of economics, as Lavoisier had investigated the existing categories of pH logistic chemistry with the aid of oxygen. In Preface 99, in order to know what surplus value was, he had to know what value was. First and foremost, Ricardo's theory of value itself had to be subjected to criticism. Marx therefore investigated labor from the point of view of its value-forming quality, and established for the first time what labor, why, how it formed value, and that value in general is nothing more than congealed labor of this kind. A point Rodbertus never grasped to the end of his days. Marx then investigated the relation between commodities and money, and demonstrated how and why, by virtue of their inherent value property, commodities and commodity exchange must give rise to the antithesis of commodities and money. The theory of money which Marx founded on this basis is the first comprehensive theory of money, and it is now everywhere tacitly accepted. He investigated the transformation of money into capital, and proved that this rested on the sale and purchase of labor power for labor as the value-creating property. Marx solved at a single stroke one of the difficulties which had caused the Ricardian school to founder: the impossibility of bringing the mutual exchange of capital and labor into accordance with the Ricardian law of the determination of value by labor. By distinguishing between constant and variable capital, Marx was able for the first time to depict the process of surplus value formation in its true course, even in the minutest details, and thus to explain it, which none of his predecessors were able to do. He thereby established a distinction within capital itself, which neither Rodbertus nor the bourgeois economists was in a position even to approach, but which provides the key for solving the most intricate economic problems. The present Volume 2, and still more so, as we shall see, Volume 3, offer the most striking proof of this. In the further investigation of surplus value itself, Marx discovered its two forms, absolute and relative surplus value, and demonstrated the different, but in both cases decisive, roles that these have played in the historical development of capitalist production. On the basis of surplus value, Marx developed the first rational theory of wages that we have, and presented for the first time the basic elements of the history of capitalist accumulation, as well as depicting its historical tendency. And Rodbertus? After he had read all this, he found in it, true to the partisan economist he invariably was, an assault on society. Asterisk took the view that he himself had already described the origin of surplus value more clearly and briefly, and, finally, asserted that, while all this does apply to the present form of capital, as it historically exists, it, Brief und Socha, politisch Aufsichts, Op. Cit. Page 111. 100 Preface does not apply to the concept of capital, the utopian idea that Herr Rodbertus has of capital. Just like old Priestley, who swore by pH logiston to the end, and would hear nothing of oxygen. Only Priestley really was the first to produce oxygen, whereas Rodbertus with his surplus value, or rather, rent, simply rediscovered a commonplace, while Marx, in contrast to Lavoisier, disdained to claim that he was the first to have discovered the fact of the existence of surplus value. Everything else that Rodbertus accomplished as an economist is on the same level. His elaboration of surplus value into a utopia was already criticized by Marx, unknowingly, in The Poverty of Philosophy. Everything else that there is to say, I have already said in the preface to the German translation of that work. His explanation of trade crises as a result of underconsumption on the part of the working class is to be found already in Sismondi's Nouveaux Principes de l'économie politique, Book IV, Chapter IV, 3. The only difference is that Sismondi constantly had in mind here the world market, while Rodbertus's horizon stretches no further than the Prussian frontier. His speculations as to whether wages stem from capital or revenue pertain to scholasticism and are finally laid to rest in the third part of this second volume of Capital. His theory of rent remains his very own property, and can sleep on until Marx's manuscript criticizing it is published. Finally, his proposals to emancipate landed property in the old Prussian provinces from the pressure of capital are again thoroughly utopian. They avoid the only practical question which is involved, how can the Prussian junker receive, say, 20,000 marks and spend 30,000 marks, year after year, without running into debt? Around 1830, the Ricardian school foundered on surplus value. What 3? Thus the home market becomes ever more constricted by the concentration of riches in the hands of a small number of proprietors. A PD industry is forced more and more to seek its outlets in foreign markets, where still greater revolutions await it, i.e. the crisis of 1817, which Sismondi goes on to describe, 1819 edition, page 336. Jean-Charles Simon de Sismondi was a Swiss economist and historian. Contemporary with the utopian socialists, he also criticized certain of the contradictions of the developing capitalist society, but this was from the restricted standpoint of the petty bourgeoisie. Sismondi idealized petty commodity production. English translation, pp. 5-19, Tur Rodbertus. New Theory of Rent, pp. 15-113 of Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1I, London, 1969. Preface 101. It was unable to solve remained still more insoluble for its successors, the vulgar economists. The 2 points on which it came to grief were as follows. 1. Labor is the measure of value. Now living labor, in exchange with capital, has a lesser value than the objectified labor for which it is exchanged. Wages, the value of a definite quantity of living labor, are always smaller than the value of the product that is produced by this quantity of living labor, or in which this is expressed. The question is in fact insoluble in this form. Marx posed it correctly, and thereby answered it. It is not the labor that has a value. Labor, as value-creating activity, can just as little have a particular value as heaviness can have a particular weight, heat a particular temperature, or electricity a particular intensity of current. It is not labor that is bought and sold as a commodity, but rather labor power. Once this becomes a commodity, its value is governed by the labor embodied in it as a social product. It is equal to the labor necessary for its production and reproduction. Thus, the sale and purchase of labor power on the basis of its value in no way contradicts the economic law of value. 2. According to the Ricardian law of value, two capitals which employ the same amount of living labor at the same rate of pay, assuming all other circumstances to be also the same, produce in the same period of time products of the same value, and similarly the same amount of surplus value or profit. If they employ unequal amounts of living labor, then they cannot produce the same surplus value, or profit as the Ricardians say. However, the contrary is the case. In point of fact, equal capitals produce, on average, equal profits in the same time, irrespective of how much or how little living labor they employ. This contradiction to the law of value was already known to Ricardo, but neither he nor his followers were able to resolve it. Even Rodbertus could not ignore the contradiction, but instead of resolving it, he makes it one of the starting points for his Utopia, Zur Erkenntnis. Page 131. Marx had already resolved this contradiction in his manuscript, Zur Kritik, T in the Plan of Capital. The solution is to be included in Volume 3. Some months will still pass until its publication. And so the economists who would like to discover Marx's secret source in Rod. Asterisk for Marx's explanation of the rise of vulgar economics. See the postface to the second German edition of Capital Volume 1, Penguin Marx Library Edition, pp. 97-8. Also Chapter 1, Note 34, pp. 174-5. TC Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1I, Chapter 5 III, 3A and 6, and Chapter 10. Parts 1 and 2. See above, page 87, and Engels' preface to Volume 3. 102 Preface. Bertus, as well as his superior predecessor, have here an opportunity to show what Rodbertus's economics can accomplish. If they show how an average rate of profit can and must come about, not only without violating the law of value, but precisely on the basis of this law, then we shall have to continue our discussion. In the meantime, they had better hurry. The brilliant investigations of this Volume 2, and its entirely new results in areas that up to now have been almost untrodden, are simply premises for the material of Volume 3, in which the final results of Marx's presentation of the process of social reproduction on the capitalist basis are developed. When this Volume 3 appears, little more will be heard of an economist named Rodbertus. The second and third volumes of Capital were to be dedicated, as Marx frequently told me, to his wife, Frederick Engels, London, on Marx's birthday, the 5th of May 1884. Preface to the second edition. The present second edition is in essentials a word-for-word reprint of the first. Printer's errors have been corrected, a few stylistic faults eliminated, and a few short paragraphs that contain only repetitions have been taken out. Volume 3, which has presented quite unexpected difficulties, is now also nearly ready in manuscript. If I remain in good health, it will be able to go to press this autumn. F. Engels, London, the 15th of July 1893. Asterisk. For the sake of convenience, a brief summary is given here of the various manuscripts, III, from which this volume is compiled. Pages. Manuscript. Date Part 127V versus note found among extracts from books. 1877, 8200, 206. IV. Before 1870, 2078. 8. After 1878, 208, 29. IV. Before 1870, pp. 211-12 and 218. Notes from MS2, 1870. 109, 110, 20, 120, 23, 123, 96, 1969. 1870, 1878, 1877, 8, 1877, 104. Preface to the second edition. Pages. Manuscript. Date Part 2 233-42.
IV.
Before 1870, 242, 424.
2.
1870 Part 3 427-34.
2. 1870 435 65. 8. 1878 465 70. 2. 1870 470 71. 8.
1878 471 4.
2. 1870 474 97. 8. 1878 498 513. 2. 1870 513 56. 8. 1878 556 64. 2. 1870 565 99. 8. 1878.
Capital. Volume 2. Part 1. The Metamorphoses of Capital and their Circuit. Chapter 1. The Circuit of Money Capital. The circuit of capital comprises three stages. As we have depicted them in Volume 1, These form the following series. First stage. The capitalist appears on the commodity and labor markets as a buyer. His money is transformed into commodities. It goes through the act of circulation MC. Second stage. Productive consumption by the capitalist of the commodities purchased. He functions as capitalist producer of commodities. His capital passes through the production process. The result. Commodities of greater value than their elements of production. Third stage. The capitalist returns to the market as a seller. His commodities are transformed into money. They pass through the act of circulation CM. Thus the formula for the circuit of money capital is MC. P. CM. The dots indicate that the circulation process is interrupted, while C and M denote an increase in C and M as the result of surplus value. In Volume 1, the first and third stages were discussed only insofar as this was necessary for the understanding of the second stage, the capitalist production process. Thus the different forms with which capital clothes itself in its different stages, alternately assuming them and casting them aside, remained uninvestigated. These will now be the immediate object of our inquiry. In order to grasp these forms in their pure state, we must first of all abstract from all aspects that have nothing to do with the change and constitution of the forms as such. We shall therefore assume here, both that commodities are sold at their values, and that the circumstances in which this takes place do not change. We shall also ignore any changes of value that may occur in the course of the cyclical process. 1. This introductory section is taken from manuscript II. 110 The Metamorphoses of Capital and their Circuit I. First stage, MC2. MC represents the conversion of a sum of money into a sum of commodities. The buyer transforms his money into commodities, the sellers their commodities into money. What makes this particular act of commodity circulation a part of the whole process with a well-defined function in the independent circuit of an individual capital is not primarily the form of the act, but rather its material content, the specific use character of the commodities that change place with money. These are on the one hand means of production, on the other, labor power, the material and the personal factors of commodity production. Their precise nature must of course depend on the type of article to be product. If we call labor power L, means of production MP and the sum of commodities to be purchased C, then we have C equals L plus MP. To abbreviate, C, L. The act MC, considered in respect of its content, MP is thus represented by M underscore C. L. MC breaks up into ML and MMP. MP the money M divides into two portions, one for the purchase of labor power, the other for means of production. The two sets of pure chases pertain to completely different markets, one to the commodity market proper, the other to the labor market. But apart from this qualitative division of the commodities into which M is transformed, M underscore C. L also exhibits a most characteristic MP quantitative relationship. We know that the value or price of labor power is paid to its proprietor, who offers it for sale as a commodity, in the form of wages, i.e. as the price of a sum of labor that contains surplus labor. Thus, if the value of a day's labor power is 3 shillings, the product of 5 hours labor, this sum may figure in the contract between buyer and seller as the price or wage for perhaps 10 hours labor. If a contract of this kind is made with 50 workers, they have to provide the buyer with a total of 500 hours labor each day, half of this. 250 hours or 25 10-hour working days, consisting simply of surplus labor. The means of production to be purchased must be sufficient in quantity and volume to employ this amount of labor. Thus M underscore C. L does not simply express the qualitative relationship MP2. From here Manuscript 7, begun the 2nd of July 1878. The circuit of money capital 111 in which a certain sum of money, e.g. £422, is transformed into means of production and labor power of a corresponding sum, but also a quantitative ratio between the portions of the money spent on labor power L and on means of production MP, this ratio being conditioned from the start by the excess or surplus labor that the number of workers involved have to expend. If the weekly wages of 50 workers in a spinning mill come to £50, for example, then it will be necessary to spend £372 on means of production. If this is the value of the means of production that a working week of 3,000 man-hours, 1,500 of these being surplus labor, transforms into yarn. The degree to which the expenditure of excess labor requires an excess value in the form of means of production is quite unimportant here. The point is simply that under all circumstances the part of the money that is spent on means of production, the means of production bought in MMP, must be sufficient, i.e. must be reckoned up from the start and be provided in appropriate proportions. To put it another way, the means of production must be sufficient in mass to absorb the mass of labor which is to be turned into products through them. If sufficient means of production are not present, then the surplus lahore which the purchaser has at his disposal cannot be made use of, his right to dispose of it will lead to nothing. If more means of production are available than disposable labor, then these remain unsaturated with labor, and are not transformed into products. Once the movement M underscore CL is completed, the purchaser does not MP merely have at his disposal the means of production and labor power needed to produce a useful article. He has also a greater capacity to set labor power in motion, or a greater quantity of labor, than is needed to replace the value of the labor power, as well as the means of production that are required to realize or objectify this A. LJ. L. Amount of labor. He thus controls the factors of production for articles of a greater value than their elements of production, for a mass of commodities containing surplus value. The value that he has advanced in the form of money thus now exists in a natural form in which it can be realized as value which breeds surplus value, in the shape of commodities. In other words, it exists in the state or form of productive capital, with the ability to function as creator of value and surplus value. We call capital in this form P. The value of P, however, equals the value of L plus MP, that of the money M transformed into L plus MP. M is the same capital value as P. 112 The metamorphoses of capital in their circuit only in a different mode of existence, i.e. capital value in the state or form of money. Money capital. M_C, L. Or MC in its general form, a sum of commodity pure MP chases. This act of general commodity circulation is thus at the same time, as a stage in the independent circuit of capital, the transformation of capital value from its money form into its productive form, or more briefly the transformation of money capital into productive capital. In the first figure of the circuit to be considered here, money appears as the original bearer of the capital value, and hence money capital appears as the form in which capital is advanced. As money capital, it exists in a state in which it can perform monetary functions, in the present case the functions of general means of purchase and payment. The latter, in that although labor power is bought beforehand, it is paid for only after it has done its work. In so far as the means of production are not readily available on the market, but have to be ordered, money also functions as means of payment in MMP. Money capital does not possess this capacity because it is capital, but because it is money. On the other hand, the capital value in its monetary state can perform only monetary functions, and no others. What makes these into functions of capital is their specific role in the movement of capital, hence also the relationship between the stage in which they appear and the other stages of the capital circuit. In the present case, for instance, money is converted into commodities which in their combination constitute the natural form of productive capital. This form therefore already bears latently within it, as its possibility, the result of the capitalist production process. A part of the money that performs the function of money capital in M_CL passes over, by accomplishing this very circulation, into MP function in which its capital character vanishes though its money character remains. The circulation of money capital M breaks up into MMP and ML, purchase of means of production and purchase of labor power. Let us consider the latter process by itself. ML, on the capitalist's part, is the purchase of labor power. It is the sale of labor power on the part of the worker, the owner of labor power. We can say, labor, here, as the wage form is presupposed. What is MC, ML, for the purchaser, is here, as in every sale, LM, CM, for the seller, the worker, in this case the sale of his labor power. The latter is for the circuit of money capital 113 center of labor, the first stage of circulation, or the first metamorphosis of the commodity, Volume 1, Chapter 3, 2. It is the transformation of his commodity into its money form. The worker spends the money thus received bit by bit on a sum of commodities that satisfy his needs, on articles of consumption. The overall circulation of his commodity thus presents itself as LMC, i.e. firstly LM, CM, and secondly MC, LE. In the general form of simple commodity circulation CMC, where money figures simply as an evanescent means of circulation, as merely mediating the conversion of one commodity into another. ML is the characteristic moment of the transformation of money capital into productive capital, for it is the essential condition without which the value advanced in the money form cannot really be transformed into capital, into value producing surplus value. MMP is necessary only in order to realize the mass of labor bought by way of ML. This is why ML was presented from this point of view in Volume 1, Part 2, the transformation of money into capital. Here we have to consider the matter from a further aspect, with special reference to money capital as a form of appearance of capital. ML is generally regarded as characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. But this is in no way for the reason just given, i.e. because the purchase of labor power is a contract of sale which determines that a greater quantity of labor is provided than is necessary to replace the price of the labor power, the wage, i.e. because surplus labor is provided, which is the basic condition for the capitalization of the value advanced, or, what comes to the same thing, for the production of surplus value. It is rather on account of its form, because in the form of wages labor is bought with money, and this is taken as the characteristic feature of a money economy. Here again, it is not the irrationality of the form that is taken as characteristic. This irrationality is rather overlooked. The irrationality consists in the fact that labor as the value-forming element cannot itself possess any value, and so a certain quantity of labor cannot have a value that is expressed in its price, in its equivalence with a certain definite quantity of money. We know, however, that wages are simply a disguised form, a form in which the price of a day's labor power, for example, presents itself as the price of the labor set in motion in the course of a day by this labor power, so that the value produced by this labor power in 6 hours labor, say, is expressed as the value of its 12-hour functioning or labor. ML is taken as the characteristic feature or hallmark of the so-called 114 the metamorphoses of capital in their circuit money economy because labor appears here as the commodity of its possessor, and hence money as its buyer, in other words because of the money relation, sale and purchase of human activity. But money appears very early on as a buyer of so-called services, without its being transformed into money capital, and without any revolution in the general character of the economy. It is quite immaterial, as far as the money is concerned, what sort of commodities it is transformed into. Money is the universal equivalent form of all commodities, which already show in their prices that they ideally represent a specific sum of money, expect to be transformed into money, and only receive the form in which they can be converted into use values for their possessor by changing places with money. Thus, once labor power is found on the market as a commodity, its sale taking place in the form of a payment for labor, in the wage form, then its sale and purchase is no more striking than the sale and purchase of any other commodity. What is characteristic is not that the commodity labor power can be bought, but the fact that labor power appears as a commodity. By way of M_CL. The transformation of money capital into pro-productive capital, the capitalist effects a connection between the objective and the personal factors of production, insofar as these factors consist of commodities. If money is to be transformed for the first time into productive capital, or to function as money capital for the first time for its possessor, then he must first buy the means of production, buildings, machines, etc. before he buys labor power, for when the labor power passes into his control, the means of production must also be present before it can be applied as labor power. This is how the matter presents itself from the capitalist side. From the worker's side, the productive application of his labor power is possible only when this has been associated with the means of production, as the result of its sale. Before the sale, this labor power exists in a state of separation from the means of production, from the objective conditions of its application. In this state of separation, it can be directly used neither for the production of use values for its possessor, nor for the production of commodities which he could live from selling. But as soon as it is associated with the means of production, by being sold it forms a component of the productive capital of its buyer as much as the means of production do. Hence, although in the Act ML the possessor of money and the circuit of money capital 115 possessor of labor power relate to each other only as buyer and seller, confront each other as possessor of money and possessor of a commodity, and are thus from this point of view simply in a money relationship with each other, the buyer appears right from the start as the possessor of the means of production which form the objective conditions for the productive expenditure of labor power by its possessor. In other words, these means of production confront the possessor of labor power as someone else's property. The buyer, conversely, is confronted by the seller of labor as another's labor power which must pass into his control, and has to be incorporated into his capital in order for this really to function as productive capital. The class relation between capitalist and wage labor is thus already present, already presupposed, the moment that the two confront each other in the Act LM from the side of the worker. This is a sale and purchase, a money relation, but a sale and purchase in which it is presupposed that the buyer is a capitalist and the seller a wage laborer, and this relation does in fact exist, because the conditions for the realization of labor power, i.e. means of subsistence and means of production, are separated, as the property of another, from the possessor of labor power. We are not concerned here with how this separation arises. If ML takes place, it already exists. What is important here is that, if ML appears as a function of money capital, or money appears here as a form of existence of capital, then this is in no way simply because money is involved here as the means of payment for a human activity with a useful effect, for a service, thus in no way because of money's function as means of payment. Money can be spent in this form only because labor power is found in a state of separation from its means of production, including the means of subsistence as means of production of labor power itself, and because this separation is abolished only through the sale of labor power to the owner of the means of production, a sale which signifies that the buyer is now in control of the continuous flow of labor power, a flow which by no means has to stop when the amount of labor necessary to reproduce the price of labor power has been performed. The capital relation arises only in the production process because it exists implicitly in the act of circulation, in the basically different economic conditions in which buyer and seller confront one another, in their class relation. It is not the nature of money that gives rise to this relation, it is rather